Okay.
Also, if you're not authorized, you know what I'm saying, to do no filming, please don't do no filming. If you're filming this, or if you're gonna film it, you gotta get it cleared, put it up. All right, pictures is fine, but as far as filming and all that, don't do that. That's why he already doing that. I'll surround. All of the shot, you feel? Thank you.
So everybody listening at home, we're gonna get started in about 10 minutes. So now, once again, this is a very controversial subject. You know what I'm saying? And it's mainly controversial because there are people who are unlearned and have not studied under Commanding General Yohanan and ISUPK. You understand? But what was passed down to us, and this is why this lecture is so important, is because I'm gonna tell you something. When this chart was given to head priest Ariah, it was a vision. We didn't have any of this archaeology. You know what I'm saying? Like all this came later on in time after head priest Yeshaya and them started digging into the archives and pulling this up. Because I'm sure if y'all were watching the class with General Mahimi, he broke down the scripture, the earth shall help the woman. You understand? And the earth opened up and swallowed up all them lies from the dragon. Meaning what? All that archaeology that starts coming out. Now, me personally, all I needed when I came into the truth was Genesis 49. I didn't need a damn thing else. I saw Genesis 49, and if you were spiritual, brother, you understand? Like if you could really understand these scriptures, then you're gonna see that that's us clear as day. You understand? So now, what comes down to is that all this archaeology, you understand, is just backing up exactly what was said since 1969. So, you know what I'm saying? So I want to say Yahweh Shem Yahweh Shabbarakatham to all my brothers, you understand? Yahweh Shema Thumb by Shem Yahweh Shah to all my sisters. This is the ISUPK, One West, under Commanding General Yohanan. And I did clap it up, definitely. I want to definitely thank all the generals I harass on a daily basis, you understand, for breakdowns on Hebrew, counseling, you know what I'm saying, all that. You understand? Captain Zaryak, because I was able to study at his foot in order to do lectures with him. So this was a breeze putting this together. I promise you that. You know what I'm saying? And Captain Mawaquad and every brother that operates under him from Captain DeBar Moth all the way on down. You know what I'm saying? So we're going to get into it. Give me the next slide. Next slide. So now, a lot of you are familiar with the curses. You understand? That everything that would befall upon Israel if we did not hearken onto his word, if we didn't listen to him. So a lot of times they try to turn around, they try to say that Hispanics and Native Indians and the Indians of the Americas, they do not fit the curses, which is a damn lie. I promise you that. And we're about to prove that today. You understand? That's one of the major identifying markers as to who we are today is the curses that the Lord put on us, unfortunately. Unfortunately, we shouldn't have had to go through none of this. You understand? But it's cursed shall we be in the city, cursed shall we be in the field. Our sons and daughters were given on to another people, and we long for them all the day long. Now, I'm going to be paraphrasing because I'm trying to move through this material. Y'all should know these scriptures. We're in Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter right now. That we served our enemies in hunger, in thirst, in nakedness, in want of all things. Yokes of iron that were put around our neck. You understand? I can make sure that y'all phones is on mute as well, all right? So now, that the Lord brought a nation of fierce countenance from afar to the end of the earth, you understand, which destroyed us. And they do not regard the person of young nor the person of old. Let me get the next slide. All right, I need you just focused on these slides right now, all right? So now, of course, everybody knows into Egypt shall we go again with ships. You understand? Now, what a lot of people don't know is because our history was blurred, was blacked out, whited out, blurred out. Right. Is that the North American Indians went into slavery with ships, starting with the Taino Indians, the Mexican Indians, the Gadites, so-called North American Indians. And I dug it up for this lecture. Right. And you better find it out today. So this is Deuteronomy 28. Y'all know this. Next slide. So now this is a book right here that the blood stay pure. This was a sister who went and did some research. Now, remember, one of the other curses is what? We would lose our identity, and also that we would be a byword, you understand, a proverb to all nations. Next slide. So now, what's the number one thing that they like to say? Oh, all the 12 tribes are Negroes. I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree with you in the slightest bit. The problem is that there's only two arguments that I hear against the 12 tribe chart. One of them is colorism. Only slaves argue about color. Only slaves argue about complexion. You go over there to Ethiopia, there's light-skinned Ethiopians, there's dark-skinned Ethiopians. And neither one of them disagree that they're the same people. Neither one of them fight with each other. Neither one of them try to not support each other. You understand? Well, because we were divided and conquered because of our complexion, we do that. But what we're about to find out is that in this book in 2013, she turns around and starts tracing the origins, that it traced back to medieval Italy, where it was a classification of skin color, not race. So when you drop down, it says that in Portuguese colony of Brazil, Indians were called Negros de Terra, meaning Negroes of the land. The Indians were called Negroes originally before they were being called Indians. You understand? That whole lie about Columbus landing in India, or that he didn't know or he discovered America, we're going to destroy that tonight too. Columbus was a Sephardic Jew. He was Jewish. He knew where the hell he was going because of Ezra's. We're going to get into that. Let me get the next slide. So now what you're also going to see is that there was laws that she started to break out, that the closest Indian cities were guilty of a murder. So at this conference that she had, she turns around and she shares that in October of 1665, according to Henning statutes at large, the laws of Virginia, if an Englishman was murdered, aka the devil in the earth, the so-called white man, the closest Indian town would be held accountable for the crime. So if they was doing that to the Gaddacks, who else did they do that to? They did that to Rosewood. They did that to Black Wall Street. We fit everything. Everything that happened to the so-called Negro inside of America happened to the other so-called Negro inside of America, aka the North American Indian, aka the Puerto Ricans. You understand? Aka the Mexican Indians. These were laws that they created. Give me the next slide. So now, authorities in 1860 assumed that the Nanciaticos had committed a murder. They reenacted Henning statutes and ordered all children under 12 be endangered to the English as servants until the age of 24. The Indians were forbidden to return to their home, or they shall be transported beyond the sea to England or some of the islands there and bound for slavery for 7 years. Don't tell me we ain't going to slavery with slave ships. And that's only one instance. That's only when the English was doing it to us. Next slide. The transatlantic slave trade. Histories of the transatlantic slave trade typically focus on those enslaved in North America, and they overlook its southern counterpart, meaning South America. Now, what a lot of fake Israelites try to do, and I say fake Israelites because just because you know you Israel don't mean you got the truth. You understand? Right. So now what they try to do is they try to turn around and say, well, it was the Negroes that was brought to South America. Those are the Israelites, those that were in the maroon colonies. They don't understand that slavery started with us first. So now, was there slave imports from Africa overwhelmingly taken to America and the Caribbean? Absolutely. Were they put in areas such as Brazil, Colombia, and Bolivia? Absolutely. Next slide. You got it? So now, yet, not unlike North America, slavery existed in South America even before African slave importation. Meaning what? Slavery started in America with the North American Indians. It started in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You understand? After Christopher Columbus's discovery of the Americas in 1492, much of South America was divided between the Spanish and the Portuguese. When the Europeans arrived in South America, they enslaved the native inhabitants and used them as free. What happened here? I hear you. What happened to my speaker though? I hear you. Y'all hear me? No sweat. I think it might be this microphone. We got another microphone. The battery's dead in this. Let me see here. Boom. Take that. All right, here we go. So now, what you're going to see is that we were forced to go into mines. and pick cotton and sugarcane and tobacco. You understand? They did the same thing to us. Next slide. So now, we don't have certain depictions because there was no photographs. All we have is murals. But they have murals dating back from the 1500s, 1600s, all the way up into the 1900s, portraying what our slavery looked like, where we were lynched and we were hung. We were whipped. We were forced to convert to Christianity and forced to mine their gold for them. Next slide. The transatlantic slave trade. Native American slavery is a piece of history of slavery that has been glossed over. Let me tell you something, man. The United States right now is putting out textbooks that call the transatlantic slave trade the transatlantic migration. There's so much history that they're ashamed of, or that they don't want people to know of, because they want to seem as though this righteous nation that they don't tell you, you understand, but this professor did. This is from Linford D. Fisher, associate professor at Brown University. Between 1492 and 1880, between 2 and 5.5 million Native Americans were enslaved in the Americas, in addition to 12.5 million African slaves. Now, of course, when it says Africans, we're talking about Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Now, when it talks about the Indians, it's talking about all the Indians in the Caribbean, Simeon, Manasseh, Ephraim, so on and so forth, all the way on down to Issachar, our brothers and sisters, you understand? So now, while natives had been forced into slavery and servitude as early as 1636, it was not until King Philip's War that natives were enslaved at large numbers. And then what did they start doing? During the English War, New England colonies routinely shipped Native American slaves to Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, Spain, Tangiers, North Africa. You understand? Africans were slave masters too, man. Stop trying to love them Hamites. You got a problem with that? Turn this lecture off right now. Walk out, do whatever you want. You understand? Next slide. And now, the reason why that's so important too is because, listen, they destroyed all of our people. They hid this history. Listen, we just gonna get into it. English authorities focused first on disarming natives, either by selling guns turned in by surrenderers or prohibiting them from bearing arms. That's the same thing that they did to Judah. You understand? They try to forbid us from bearing arms. You ever look at the major cities, right, that have the strictest gun laws? It's where the most Black and Hispanics is at, because they don't want to arm us, man. You understand? Well, that's the same thing that they did with Gad. So now it says, in addition, Native communities. Now, once again, I might be skipping over some information, but like I said, there's a lot of information. I'm trying to move through this right now. So I'm going to leave this up. If y'all at home, y'all want to pause the screen, y'all do all that. Y'all here reading it, go ahead and get down. All right. In addition, Native communities were asked to pay an annual tribute. You understand? So meaning they would tax us. They would pay tribute. They enslaved us in any single way imaginable and possible. And that's what the law said. The law said that they would lend to us and we would not lend to them. We'd have to go to them for want of all things. Next slide. So now the shadow of Native American enslavement in New England extends into the 18th century and beyond, Fisher says. There were no records of people petitioning for freedom in the 1740s who were the descendants of Native Americans first enslaved during King Philip's War. In the study, he writes, small legal loopholes and dishonest practices on the ground ensured in many cases limited term service continued into lifelong and even heritable slavery. This is what they did to us with Jim Crow. You understand? This is what they did to us in Reconstruction in the South with slavery. This is the 13th Amendment all over again. This is sharecropping. They found ways to create laws and different avenues in order to keep the Native Americans enslaved. So now it says, a law passed the same year by Rhode Island General Assembly seemed to surface to outlaw Indian slavery. But Fisher notes in practice that other laws ensured that Native surrenderers were disposed of for the benefit of the colony, man. They would murder us. They would enslave us. Read on. Excuse me, next slide. Fisher also argues that there was an ideological component to enslaving Native Americans among colonists. There was a presumption involving the innate inferiority of natives. This is the same thing they say about our brother Judah. You understand? They tried to make natives inside the Americas inferior the same way they try to say we're dumb, we're lazy, this, that, and the third. When realistically, the white man's inferior to us. What could he beat us at? Not a goddamn thing. You understand? Ain't a damn thing that he's better than us at. And now, this prejudice that they had, mind you, this is why they say that we would run around naked. This is why they try to say we didn't have no government structure or we were uncivilized, when you're about to find the complete opposite. Next slide. So now, this is also extremely important. This was an article that was put up. This is a brother who believed he was Hispanic. And the problem is that you got so many people who think that Hispanics, you understand, though the Hispanics rather that we speak about are the conquistadors. They think we're talking about the Europeans. Listen, a Hispanic brother that we're talking about is a descendant of the North American Indians, whether it be in Mexico, whether it be in the Caribbean. And now, this same brother having the last name Cortez or Hernandez, so on and so forth, is no different than a brother having the last name Washington. So now they found this brother in New Mexico. So now this is Lenny Trujillo, and he made a startling discovery when he began researching his descendant from one of New Mexico's pioneering Hispanic families. One of his ancestors was a slave. I didn't know about New Mexico's slave trade, so I was just stunned. So he didn't know. He thought he was Hispanic. He thought he was from Spain. Come to find out, his family was Indians that was enslaved, and they gave him the Hispanic name. They forced Spanish on him. So now he turns around and says, one of the many Latinos who are finding out ancestral connections to a flourishing slave trade on the blood-soaked frontier known as the American Southwest. Their captive forebears, you understand, were Native Americans, slaves, also known as Janeros. So now this is the name that they were called for the slaves. And they start talking about the bondage that they were in Mexico and New Mexico. The revelations have prompted some painful personal reckonings over identity and heritage, but they have also been fueled, you understand, politically charged to debate on what it means to be Hispanic and Native American. We're discovering that we're discovering things that complicate the hell out of our history, demanding that we reject the myths that we've been taught. We've been taught lies, man. You understand? You don't educate a slave. They told us that we were our slave masters. They told us that these were our people. This was our culture. Everything that Judah went through, you understand, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Issachar went through all the way on down. We all shared the same pain. It wasn't like one was hurt more than the other. You understand? And that makes us brothers even in that instant. You understand? And that's something that we got to identify with. We got to identify that we all wearing the same jersey. We're on the same team, and we have a common enemy. We have somebody who's trying to score against us, man, and that's keeping us oppressed inside the barrios, keeping us oppressed inside the ghetto. You understand? Making this look like Chirac. Well, I drove down the block of 79. I was like, this is the goddamn jungle. And it's like that in Newark. It's like that in Spanish Harlem. You understand? It's like that in, well, Roxbury is getting gentrified right now, but it's like that in Worcester. You understand? It's like that around the earth, wherever we are. So now, meaning that you got Hispanics who need to wake up to their identity the same way you got Judites who got to realize that they're not American. We all need to realize who we are. And that's the importance of the 12 tribe chart. That's the importance of this lecture, because we have to come into who we are. You understand? We are the 12 tribes of Israel. Next slide, please. So now, what you're going to see is that we all know about the history of lynchings that took place with Judah. Next slide. We all know that the white man's the devil and he takes pleasure in murdering us. You understand? Next slide. But what we don't know is that this right here was a Taino. You understand? Some people say he was an Arawak. All I know is that this was a cacique. You understand? Meaning a chief over in the Tainos. And this brother right here, they turned around and they're trying to forcibly convert him to Christianity. And he turned around and said, is there going to be more white Christians in heaven? He said, yeah. He said, then I'll go to hell. And then they burnt him at the stake. The same way that they lynched us, the same way you understand, the same way they did it to Judah, they did it to us. All of us went through the same things. Next slide. So now this is the unknown history of Latino lynchings. We all know that they did this to Judah, Benjamin, Levi. What we don't know is that they were doing this to Ephraim. They were doing this to Manasseh. They were doing this, you understand, to Issachar. Don't ever try to tell me the Mexicans ain't our brothers, man. Next slide. These lynchings took place in the Southwest U.S. and present-day Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Nevada. These killings were carried out by vigilantes and other masked men as a form of street justice. Tell me that don't sound like the KKK. You understand? So now, These killings were carried out, these killings became so bad that the Mexican government lodged official complaints to the U.S. Council in Mexico, given that its region of the U.S. was at one time Mexican land and it was shared with the Indians. So now what you're going to find out is that they said F us too. You understand? As always. Next slide. Delgado goes on to cite that only some U.S. historians have written about these Latino lynchings and have pointed out that they occurred due to racial prejudice and protection of turf and Yankee nationalism. So now give me the next slide. What you're going to find out is that the reason why we don't know that this happened to us is because, one, there's only a handful of American scholars who covered it, which means what? It was other Latinos and Hispanics who were covering it. So as a result of them covering it, it was written in another language. It was written in Spanish. It was written in Portuguese. So we didn't even have access to it. And once again, this is another point in history that was glossed over. Just like the North American Indians going on slave ships. Just like the Taínos going on slave ships with Columbus. This is all history that they don't teach us because, once again, you do not educate a slave. Next slide. Further exploration reveals that these lynchings were not only edited and minimized outright, but were also ignored or misrepresented due to primary accounts in the community newspapers being written in Spanish. Since very few mainstream historians read Spanish or consulted with these records, they were left to flounder. And it got down to the point where our own people ain't believing. It got down to the point where we started to just think that this was myth and folklore. It's like that, what's that rapper? B.O.B. getting high thinking the slave trade doesn't exist. You understand? It's the same thing. We start thinking that the transatlantic slave trade was a myth. Well, that's the same thing that happened with these lynchings. Next slide. So now, once again, the encomienda system. This is another term for Indian slavery, which is another reason that we don't know that the Indians were enslaved. You look this up, this was something that started off just like sharecropping. They would come, talk to a chief, give him a little bit of resources so that this way he'd be able to go and cut sugarcane. That this way he'd be able to go and mine gold. And then as a result, who would reap all the benefits of it? The Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Dutch. You understand? The devil in the earth, the so-called white man. And then eventually, this turned directly into slavery. You understand? Ultimately forced the natives into slavery. This is what the encomienda system did. And once again, it's no different than Jim Crow. It's no different than what they do to us with the amendments in the damn prison system. You understand? They got brothers right now sewing uniforms for the military for 70 cents a day. Next slide, please. So now, kill the Indian and save the man. You take a look at this. This was North American Indian boarding school. They've been separating our children from us since the beginning of time. It started with the slave ships. Now, we know all about the ICE raids that's going on right now. But what we don't know is that not only did they separate us on the slave ships, not only did they do that, but they created boarding schools where they would rip our children away from us. And look at the first thing that they did. They would cut our damn hair, man. They tried to take away our identity. They knew braids was our culture. You understand? And what they would do is try to hit the reset button. Look how their spirit shifted. You understand? After all the beatings, all the molestation. You understand? Next slide. Over the next several decades, the Karzai served as a model for nearly 150 such schools that opened around, like the 1887 Dawes Act that relocated Native American land, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs 1902 haircut order specifying that men with long hair couldn't receive rations. What is rations? Your food, survival. So if you do not want to starve to death, you have to cut your hair. You understand? And once again, that's why what General Muhammad said is so important, man. Your hair is a declaration of your freedom, of your independence. You understand? Straight up and down. Captain Young, this is no shade at you and your new haircut. I want you to know. You know what I'm saying? You can get down however you want. You know what I'm saying? I'm just saying. I'm the boss, sir. The water for being a good sport, I'm going to get checks later. Let's go. I'm going to get a $50 fine in the mail. You understand? So now what this ended up being was forced assimilation, and they forced us to become more like them. Next slide. At boarding schools, staff forced indigenous students to cut their hair, use new Anglo-Saxon American names, and, They forbid children from speaking their native language and observing their religious and cultural practices. This is the same thing that they did to Judah. This is the same thing that they did to Christianity. They forced us to become Christians. They forced us to become just like them and assimilate. You understand? And this is what's crazy. And by removing them from their homes, the schools disrupted students' relationships with their families and other members of the tribe. Because once they came back home, they could no longer relate or identify with their people. And you know what? And that's the same danger that we have when we think that our children's going to get a better education in a private school system. We send them there or to a Catholic school, they make us shave our beard, and then what ends up happening? We end up hating. Listen, that's trying to seek white love will make you hate black. You understand? So what will end up happening is that you get people who turn around and say, why do you talk white? You get people who turn around and they say, oh, you don't sound like us. And as a result, that's another way that they divide and conquer us. That's another way that we don't have unity amongst ourselves anymore. Next slide, please. Some students never made it home at all. You understand? Just like the what was it, 4,000, I think, kids that they misplaced. How many kids that are missing right now? Hispanic children that ICE took, that they have no idea where they are. Well, that's the same thing they do to us in foster care. That's the same thing that they did to us here. Boarding schools were susceptible to deadly infections like tuberculosis and flu, and schools like Carlisle had cemeteries for dead students. So they were finding mass graves of these children or reporting them as runaways. When I'll tell you what was really happening, some of these kids was rebellious. Some of these kids had a spine, and some of these kids fought back, and they murdered these kids like they murdered Tamir Rice. You understand? I'm gonna try to chill with the understands that, but that was a heavy point, Cap. I'm trying here. Next slide, please. Boarding schools based off the Carlisle model fizzled out in the earlier 20th centuries, but after that, the rupture of Native American families continued in other ways. Native kids are simply being deemed to be in unfit households with unfit mothers. Isn't that the same thing they try to say about us today? Same thing they try to say about us with child services. Don't tell me we're not the same people. We all suffering under these curses. Next slide. So now we're getting into it. This is the split in the kingdom of Israel. So now we understand that we all suffer through the same things. Well, if that's the case and they took our identity, then who the hell are we? You understand? Well, we are the children of Israel. Well, how did we get separated? How did we get over to America? Well, it started with the split in Israel. It started because Solomon decided to deal with women from other nations. And as a result, remember what the scripture says. The scripture says if you deal with a woman from another nation, your heart shall, not it might, but it shall turn from the Most High. And as a result, he was not perfect with the Lord like his father David was. Do you understand? And that's what it says right here, as the heart of his father David was. For after Solomon started to worship after their gods. You understand that he did evil in the sight of the Lord. Next slide. Next slide. My God. Next slide. They didn't program.
The kingdom ain't here yet.
Yeah, they filming to lock you. Oh, all right. So now what happens is that he eventually gives the kingdom to Jeroboam. You understand? And takes 10 pieces, he says, for the northern kingdom. Meaning what? Jeroboam, Ephraim, became the king in the north, the head of the northern kingdom, and took 10 tribes with him. You understand? But he shall have one tribe for my servant David's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, meaning what? He was a Judite. So Benjamin stayed with him. Now, the whole thing is that, well, what about Levi? Levi wasn't considered a tribe. Now, I'm not saying Levi is not considered Israel. Don't confuse it. You need land. You need to have inheritance is land. Levi didn't have land. Levi's inheritance was the sacrifices of the Most High. So as a result, Levi would be in the tribe of Ephraim, in their land, in Simeon's land, in Issachar's land, in Judah's land, and they would be performing the sacrifices. They would be performing the office of priesthood. So as a result, there was still considered 12 tribes, though there was really 13 because of the tribe of Dan. Now, the thing is with Dan is that Dan didn't go and conquer land to get an inheritance. You read about that in the book of Judges. Instead, Dan ended up moving in with Manasseh, and when we went into the Assyrian captivity, Dan never came out. So therefore, Levi ended up taking the place of Dan so that there's still 12 tribes. Next slide, please. And the priests, so now this is Second Chronicles, Second Chronicles, the 11th chapter and the 13th verse. The priests and the Levites that were in all Israel resorted to him out of all their coast. For the Levites left their suburbs and possessions and came to Judah and Jerusalem. For Jeroboam and his sons had cast them off from executing the priest's office, meaning what? The Levites were kicked out of the northern kingdom. The kingdom split. The northern kingdom was given to Ephraim, southern kingdom was given to Judah. And then we were so wicked in the northern kingdom that we didn't want the priest there. So we sent the priest. That's why when you come around to the time of Christ, who was the main three people there? Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Because Levi came down south. Next slide. So what you start to find out as well is they try to say, oh, well, Simeon was there too. Now, mind you, let me explain something as well. That doesn't mean that there was no Judites that left with us. That doesn't mean that there was no northern kingdom that was still in Jerusalem. We're talking about the bulk of the populations. Just like if you go to Miami, you got little Haiti, you got little Havana, you got little Jamaica. That doesn't mean that there's not other tribes there. It's just talking about the bulk of the people who live there. When you read in the scriptures, you find out about Anna the prophetess in the New Testament, who was an Asherite. Well, we're talking about the bulk of the populations. The problem is people are too literal. They try reading this book through the eyes of the devil, man. And as a result, they don't understand it. So now what you also start to find out is that the Lord destroyed us. You understand? There was a long season that Israel had been without a true God and without a teaching priest and without law. And during this time period, let me get the next slide. During this time period, what ended up happening is that, and he gathered Judah and Benjamin and the strangers with them out of Ephraim and Manasseh and out of Simeon, for they fell to him out of Israel in abundance. So now, meaning when you start reading these scriptures in Second Chronicles, you find out that Simeon, although he was in the south, once all this started going on, and then we ended up leaving the Lord, Simeon came up north with us. And the borders of Israel ended up completely changing. Next slide. So now it gets into the exact split. So what you start to see is that the northern kingdom, you understand, was not only Israel, but the land was starting to be called Samaria. And what happened is that we ended up doing evil in the sight of the Lord. So now what happens is Shalmaneser comes and he ends up having us pay tribute. And now while paying tribute, this is also why the scripture says that Ephraim is a silly dove. Because what you'll find out is that he ends up, and the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hosea, for he had sent messengers to the king of Egypt. We, instead of turning to the Lord like we did in ancient Egypt, we said, all right, these Assyrians, they're starting to get serious with us. They want too much. Let's go try to make allies with Egypt. So we became a silly dove because, you understand, we were a lovebird. We wanted this oppressor, we wanted to trade it for this one. Same thing we do with the Democrats or the Republicans. You understand? So now, then the king of Assyria came throughout all the lands and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. And this started what was the initiating move of the captivity of us going into Assyria. Next slide. So now in the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them into Halah and the harbor, and the river goes on. You go look where these cities were. You'll find out that there was Israel in these borders. You understand? So now, for it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord. So we sinned against the Lord, and then the Lord ended up removing us. So it says, and we walk not in the statutes, and we walked in the statutes of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel, and of the kings of Israel which they made. Next slide. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. So what he ended up doing is, because we broke the law, statutes, and commandments, he ended up rejecting us and he cast us out. And the northern kingdom was now moved into Assyria. Next slide. So initially, this is what the kingdom of Israel looked like. We were unified, but we were all given a certain land for inheritance. Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Reuben, Gad, Manasseh, all on this side. And here's another thing too. The reason why Reuben and Gad never crossed the Jordan is because they like to follow cattle. And they like to raise cattle and use that to live. That's just like the Gadites following the buffalo. They stayed on this side because it was a lot of plains. It was like the Plains Indians inside of America. You're going to find out all throughout this that these spiritual attributes fit, you understand, the North American Indian, so on and so forth. Next slide. So after the kingdom split, it started to look like this. Judah in the south, Israel in the north. We messed up with Assyria. Really, we messed up with the Lord. So the Lord sent Assyria to mess us up. You understand? And then we were taken away into Assyrian captivity. Next slide. Is there any proof? You damn right there is. This is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser in the British Museum. This is the tribute of Jehu. That is the tribute of Jehu, the house of Omri. The Assyrians kept records of what they did, who they put in captivity, who they destroyed. And that's why they found this artifact that lines up directly with what the scriptures said. Next slide. So now, accompanied by 4 attendants, King Shalmaneser stands beneath the parasol with Jehu bowing down. It's how disgraceful it is, man. Our king had to bow down to a damn heathen, man. You understand? And this was carved in there. And this is in the scriptures. Next slide. So now, 5 Israel. Now, before anybody says something, I couldn't fit the 5 on the damn screen. I know there's only 4 up there, all right? But if you go and you look at the whole obelisk, you're going to see 5. So now, what you start to see is you start to see the tribute that they were paying. These are all copper tins, and it's all filled with precious metals and rubies and gold and silver. All the things that they brought because we were paying tribute. And when we stopped paying tribute, that's when they locked Hosea up, besieged the northern kingdom, and then took us on over into captivity. And this right here is them taking us into captivity. Next slide. So now, this is one of my favorite scriptures. 2nd Ezra, a scripture that so many fake Israelites do not understand. You understand? So these are the 10 tribes those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoner out of the land at the time of Hosea. Hosea is the Greek transliteration of Hosea. So Hosea the king, whom Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, led away captive. He carried them over the waters because remember, they took us into the riverlands. They took us onto the borders of their empire. If you go into history, you'll find out they put us in the military and we would defend them from foreign invaders. But they took his counsel amongst themselves that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt. Well, where was the place that never mankind dwelt? Name somebody who was here inside the Americas besides the North American Indians. Nobody. You can't tell me they went into Africa. Africa was already inhabited by Ham. Y'all want to talk about how much y'all love Kemet so much, act like Kemet was the first damn civilization. Africa was inhabited from north to south. You understand? So now, that they might keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. This is why you find fringes with a border of blue on all the garments of the North American Indians. This is why the oldest 10 commandments is found where? Anybody know? Not you, Ken. What's up? New Mexico. Get a brother hand. You know what I'm saying? They were found in New Mexico, the Los Lunas stone. And that's not the only place that they were found because we came here with the intent of serving our power. And they entered into the Euphrates at the narrow passage of the river. The narrowest part, the narrowest part of that river is what? Is at the very mouth of it, where it opens up into the Persian Gulf. And then we came over here into the Americas. So now, it says, for the Most High showed them signs and held still the flood till they were passed over. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely 1.5 years, and the same region called Arsareth. So now, is Arsareth Turkey? Hell no. You understand? Arsareth is, we're going to find out. Next slide. I'm going to show you right now. I'm going to give you a source. Everybody should know this book. If not, this is Lost Tribes and Promised Land by Ronald Sanders. Some fake Jew. You understand? And he goes and does this history. And in this history, you start to uncover who the true Jews are, who the true Israelites are. Next slide. So now, a striking element in Columbus' geographical religiosity is his intense abiding and interest in the 4th or 2nd book of Ezra. Where you're going to find out, you understand? Now, I might get into this another time. I don't have too much time. I'm trying to move through this, right? But Columbus was not from Italy. Columbus was from Spain. His last name was Colon. So now, while they were in Spain, during the time of the Inquisition, Sephardic Jews were getting cast out of Spain. So as a result, you had things called conversos or new Christians. So during this time frame, they were trying to find a safe haven to practice their so-called religion, meaning their identity that they stole from us. And he converted to Christianity. And on this journey, you can read a couple of books, Hope Sails, The Secret Voyage of Christopher Columbus. I'm going to try to list some of them later. Even inside this book, it breaks down that Columbus was actually Jewish and that he was trying to do two things. Find the other tribes because he believed that because the prophecies, they would have all the riches. And then also so that he would find a safe haven so that this way those Jewish people would stop being persecuted from Spain and Portugal during the Inquisition. So he became obsessed with where the lost tribes went. Next slide. Contrary to legend, Columbus did not sail to prove that the earth was round. Most educated Europeans and mariners already knew that. Columbus estimated that the size of the Atlantic Ocean from reading his Bible. He had read in the second book of Esdras in the Apocrypha that God created the world in 7 parts water and 6 of them dry land. So meaning what? There was 5 continents that they knew about. They knew they were missing a continent because they read the Bible. Next slide. Well, somebody might say, how many continents are there? If you went to school in the United States, where they do not educate us at all, you were taught that there were 7 continents: Africa, Antarctica, Asia, Australia, Europe, North America, and South America. But using the criteria defined above, meaning in the article that I pulled this out, many geologists, meaning geologists from other parts of the world, say that there are 6 continents, just like the Bible said. So Columbus was reading this and he's like, there's another landmass that nobody dwelt at except for who? Those that were in Esdras. You understand? The 10 tribes which came over to Arsareth, what is Arsareth? Next slide. So now it's breaking down that he was also studying this chapter. And he talks about how he held the waters for them and they traveled another 1.5 years to a region called Arsareth. Evidently a Greek corruption of the Hebrew, which they want to say, Cap's going to laugh, but Aretz, which is Arataza. You understand? Arataza meaning earth, land, or another country. It's the Greek transliteration, just like earlier when you saw Osei, which is really Hosea. Arsareth was America, man. Next slide. So now, out of all the interpreters that Columbus could have brought with him, what do you think the language was? Let me hear it. Hebrew. There was only one interpreter that he brought with him, Luis de Torres, a so-called Jew who had occupied a position under the government. He was fluent in Hebrew because Columbus knew who the hell he was going to see. He knew who he was going to find. Right. Next slide. So now, I don't know, Katazar. What about the Bering Strait? If I may. Nobody said no. The Bering Strait is bullshit.
That's right.
You understand? That is a goddamn lie from the devil in the earth. So now the Bering Strait myth is not so much science as it is politics. Much objective modern science in the past several decades has even suggested that it is highly questionable if there ever was a so-called land bridge or ice bridge, as some have defined it. Yes, that's right. From an in-depth, intensive, non-politically affected, and unbiased scientific study of the Earth's history, countless scientists, mostly non-American, you starting to see a pattern here? Mostly non-American have concluded that there most likely never was a land bridge. Most U.S. history books and many other books written about the North American indigenous people began by propagating the Bering Strait myth, telling the silly story of thousands, even millions of early First Nation people migrating from Asia across the so-called land bridge, the Bering Strait. Next slide. We're going to destroy this today. Also known as the Bering Strait, the theory of Beringer theory, the land bridge theory, has been widely accepted since the 1930s. The idea was first postulated in a rudimentary fashion, meaning what? No science at all. This was a theory, a thought, which was by who? A Jesuit. You know anything about the Jesuits? Their whole job is to distort the truth. You understand? Like Commander General Yohanna said it best. If the Catholic Church is the American government, then the Jesuits are their CIA. They infiltrate organizations in order to make them what? Start teaching Immaculate Conception. start getting closer to the Catholic doctrine, because they realized it don't matter if you're directly aligned with us as long as you're teaching what we teach. So Jose de Acosta was one of these people who came over in 1590, and he created this theory. And as a result, everybody started to run with it. Next slide. This book right here used to be $30. It's $800 now, ever since we did breakdowns on it. That's why, if y'all want to know why I'm not putting the book listing out yet, or the complete book listing, is because I want y'all to be able to get these books before they raise the prices. So after this lecture, I'm going to be sending out the book list. Get what you can, because I guarantee you they're all going to be skyrocketing on Amazon. So now, this is Unexpected Faces Inside of Ancient America. And what you're going to find out is that he did a history and said that without a doubt, we had to have come across the Atlantic. There's no way that we didn't sail. There's no way that we came from Siberia. Next slide. Looking carefully at all the faces on the poster, one begins to wonder if the ancestors who produced this extreme variety of racial types could really have been channeled exclusively through the gateways of Siberia and Alaska. The New World, there came a moment where I felt almost like a child who finds out that Santa Claus is not real, and that the simplistic explanation of the Bering Strait alone would not be the ultimate solution of the complicated problem of America's ancient population and history. I am not the only one to have suspicions about the Bering Strait theory. Charles Bennett, anybody saying something? What's up? Y'all good? No sweat. So now, he wrote a book called The Mysteries from the Forgotten World and gives a summary on what's now being discussed and investigated and disputed amongst the ancient American history. In chapter 8, he says most anthropologists accept the theory that the ancestors